Hello, Emmanuel Church family. This is Pastor Matt, and we are here for another episode of Word of the Week, or so it has been called thus far. This is what episode? I ask that every time. The sixth episode of Word of the Week, and with that intro comes an exciting announcement for those of you that have been listening regularly. We have had a really positive response to this little thing, this podcast. We've had so many of you have reached out, even getting cards in the mail from multiple people in 1 week, just complimenting us on this little show, and we are just humbled and excited that people are actually listening, that we're not just sitting in a room talking to no one. So that is encouraging, and from what we can evaluate, everyone seems to be in favor of us continuing a podcast for our church. And so that's what we're going to do. We can announce today happily that we are laying the groundwork and making plans for making this an actual podcast. And with that in mind, I do have to let you know that sadly we're going to have to drop the name Word of the Week. We did some research, and apparently there are some other podcasts that are well known that are named that. I think from the Gospel Coalition or something like that. It's also a good podcast. So we're probably just going to call it the Emmanuel Church Podcast or something similar. Basically, the idea behind the show is just going to be a place for resources for our church and really all Christian audiences in general. We're going to discuss things like sermons, themes, special topics, and also we're going to try and look at some guest interviews over the life of the show. We'll have different pastors, leaders, Christian thinkers in to just share with you guys. We want this to serve our church, Emmanuel for sure. We want this to be a place that the people at our church, like they have been doing recently, can all chime in and listen. And this is going to be available on all the podcast platforms, hopefully. And that way you can comment and share it with your friends, different people that might be interested in the topics. And obviously it's also open to all Christian audiences, anybody that can benefit from what we may discuss. Maybe we'll talk about something in your regular commute. You'll listen to the show, something you like, and you can share it on Facebook or any of your social media outlets. So we're excited about that, and we'll be giving you more information about that in the future. So now I'm here with Pastor Blake. We're going to continue and return to our recent discussion on the prophet Jonah and Jonah's life. We started the series last week. Pastor Blake preached a sermon on Jonah, and this past Sunday he preached his second sermon on the series on Jonah. And last week we really kind of gave an overview of the book, kind of discussed its themes and a lot of things people misunderstand about Jonah and things that people can miss. Some of the beautiful things that are hidden in Jonah. And so now we're going to kind of return to that discussion. We're going to kind of look over Pastor Blake's sermon, some of the things he said, and hit a few high notes that we really wanted to take some time to discuss. So first of all, I would like to give a shout out to Pastor Blake's sermon. You can find it on our church's Facebook page if you weren't able to tune in this past Sunday. We are making our services a little shorter just for the online format. So I would encourage you, it's around 30 minutes, go back, pop your earbuds in and take a listen to what he had to say about Jonah. So Blake, give us kind of a survey, just a run-through of some of the things you were able to say this past Sunday in your sermon.
So the main focus of the text this week was verses 3 through 16, which in the Hebrew Bible, that ends chapter 1. And so we were looking at Jonah has now said that basically, I quit. Mm-hmm. He's gotten on the boat. He paid his fare, got on the boat. God says, I'm still here, gives the storm, and provides the storm. They start praying and so forth. So we saw many things, clear points about the narrative. And those of you who have been in church at all, you know the storm came. All the professional seamen, they were driven to religion, praying and so forth. They wake Jonah up. And sounds very familiar to something that we see in the Gospels. And so wake him up, and then they tell him to pray. They cast lots, and then the lots fall on him. And they say, what have you done? and he tells them, "I'm a man that fears God. I serve
The God.
the God,
Yeah.
and the Lord Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews." And they were afraid before; they're really afraid now. What are we supposed to do? Throw him over, And he says, "Well, throw me over." And then they're like, "Do we really want to throw over a
Yeah.
follower,
The servant of this God.
servant of
Yeah.
this God?" So they were torn. They tried to make it. The land could not do it, and eventually, they
Obliged him. Yeah.
They obliged him. We learn a lot about God in the fact that he is gracious and mercy, the fact that he would send one of his prophets to a wicked pagan city.
That was a cool highlight where you got to mention the depravity of the Ninevites or the Assyrian Empire, just the insane nature of this empire.
Cruel
terrible,
people.
terrible things that like we wouldn't even fathom today. Like didn't you mention in the sermon that they prided themselves in skinning people alive?
Yes.
And nailing their skin in front of them,
and they would stare at their skin while they would bake in the sun and die.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, very creative ways of torturing. So you can imagine that the Israelites found these people repulsive, and wicked. So
just the very fact that God would send his prophet to Nineveh, and he's holy and righteous, though, he says, we're going to, I'm tell them that their wickedness is before me. I'm not overlooking this. The social justice, the cruelty to humanity, as we talked about last week, is God's.
He's gonna exact justice.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. We see that through the storm. Jonah, he's a picture. He can be a picture and application of the believer. He knows God. He knows God's calling on his life. He knows knows the will of God. He rebels against all of it, quits his job, says, "I'm done with this," and
literally runs to the other end of the known world.
Right
at the time.
And then we see the first grace.
Yeah,
relentless grace. God didn't say, "Okay, you're dead." And I think we've kind of, don't tick God off. He'll kill you.
Yeah.
Well, his children whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth. He corrects. He's there for. He's pointing.
He went after Jonah.
He went after Jonah. And then the men of the sea, we see that they didn't know the Lord at all. They're a representation of the pagan world.
Yeah.
Those who do not know, who do not believe, who worship other gods, who put other things before him. And then they weren't looking for God.
No. Yeah, mariners heading in that direction, modern day Spain. Okay,
right.
So they were definitely pagan, very disconnected from probably the Hebrew world.
Absolutely. And so they're not looking for the hand of God, and yet they see it.
Yeah, he shows up.
That is sovereign grace right there.
To
really find something that you weren't even looking for.
Yeah.
And so that brought us into the main points, the alliterated points of the deadly storm, which is a representation in our application of consequences of sin and the coming judgment.
Yeah.
That's what we see, that sin, there is a consequence for sin right now as we live, but it is also a snapshot of what is to come in suffering and in death and so forth.
Yeah, that claps back to what Jesus said about the Tower of Siloam that fell and killed all the people. People asked him, well, what have these people done? Jesus connected natural disasters and unexplained tragedies as just a foretaste of the wrath that will come. And even in today, we're in a time where everyone's wondering what in the world's going on,
right.
with the world seemingly at a standstill. Yeah. But really it's all just a taste of God's wrath. And we see that in Jonah poured out.
So then we see the desperation of the sailors. So we see that, and this was interesting, we didn't really we'll point this out some more, but the instinct of the mariners was whatever is the cause of the storm is also, in their mind, is the remedy. And if we're not, we fall into that too. We think, okay, it's because of our sin. Okay, well then the answer is my righteousness.
Yeah, I'll just be better.
I'll just be better. So they were looking for what was the cause of this, and whatever the cause is, that's going to be the remedy.
Yeah.
And that came to the delivered sacrifice. That was point 3. And the fact there was only one that could calm the sea, and that was...
and we got to pause there for a second for those of you that are listening, if you've been a Christian for long, that the old covenant, which was based on the sacrificial system, all pointing to Christ's sacrifice. So every time you see the sacrificial system in the old covenant in the Old Testament, you have to connect it to the new covenant, the pointing to the ultimate sacrifice of Christ. So you got to realize a tiny little foreshadowing was in every sacrifice ever given, every just one. And right here in this storm with these mariners, these pagan mariners, they offer a sacrifice.
Right.
So they quite literally feared God. They became believers right there on the vessel, and they partook in. They probably didn't understand it fully, but they partook in the sacrificial system, which points to the ultimate sacrifice, which is awesome that Jesus in many ways was there in the story even that long ago.
Right.
The ultimate lamb.
So the delivered sacrifice, of course, on the boat was Jonah.
Yeah.
The throwing over of Jonah, and but we see that, as we're going to segue into that, is that Jesus is the better Jonah. And
yeah.
So,
that was the I think the iceberg that we hit. The beautiful, awesome, awe-inspiring nugget that you hit on Sunday that we could just talk about forever. But Jesus being the better Jonah, what a thought! And
we're not just giving him that label. We didn't find a creative way.
Oh, no. He connects himself to Jonah.
He connects himself to that. Matthew 12, Luke 11. And so he connects himself to that.
He is this weird throwing back to Jonah, making these statements. And why did he pick Jonah, to say, like, I gotta die like Jonah was 3 days in the whale? It's like, what? I don't know if the people listening to him at the time got that connection. Right. Maybe they did. Maybe they understood Jonah better than we did. But I don't think modern listeners, Christians, or Southern Christians right here in our context, think about Jesus' connection to Jonah. Right. Him quoting Jonah. We think of, once again, Jonah's the cute fish story, not so connected to Jesus. But let's talk about how Jesus connects to Jonah. You sent me this thing that, or told me about the sermon that Tim Keller preached on through this, and we're going to give a shout out to that.
Oh, yeah. Me too, definitely.
If you want to listen to a great supplemental sermon on this, look up Tim Keller's sermon on Jonah. But he points out an interesting thing that the sailors asked Jonah. So God's angry, everything's riled up, was this you? And Jonah says, yes, it's me. Throw me over. That was his answer. But Jesus, you can ask Jesus, is God's wrath upon us because of you? And Jesus says, no, it's not because of me. It's actually because of you. But throw me over. Like, what an awesome turn that Keller did a great job with that. Like, Jesus, God's wrath wasn't poured out because of Jesus. It's poured out because of our sin.
That's right.
And so it's looming over our heads. But Jesus says it's your fault that God is angry, and justice cries out against your sin. But I'll jump overboard. I'll be the one that dies.
You're the problem. And religion today says that because we're the problem, we have to be the solution. Yes. Jesus says, you are the problem, but I'm the solution.
I'm the solution. I'll jump into the sea and die. Well, what an awesome thing. Yeah. And so, when you look at that, the mirror there of Jesus jumping and connecting his death in the grave with the whale,
right.
He jumped to save his bride, and was in the earth, died in death for 3 days. And when you think about that, the allegory there of Jonah, now it's like light bulb. Jonah was the grumpy, begrudging, guy who didn't want to share the gospel, didn't want to save these terrible sinners. Jesus happily did the will of the Father.
Yep.
Right. So talk to us about Jesus as we talked some about this, about Jesus as the better missionary, right? His response.
Yeah, absolutely. As the better missionary, he's the one who has every right to withhold grace.
Yeah.
Every right to claim all grace for himself, and yet he lavishes it all out, as opposed to Jonah.
Yeah, look at Jonah. He hoards it.
Yeah, he hoards it. I'm better than you. I
Yeah.
follow the law. I serve Yahweh and so
I'm a
forth.
Hebrew,
I'm
yeah.
a Hebrew. Even though Israel was not in a good place spiritually at this time.
Yeah, that's true.
And his patriotism overshadowed his discernment,
Yeah.
his spiritual discernment. Let that be a warning for us.
Yeah, a little time out there.
Time out right there.
Yeah.
Don't let our patriotism
Yeah, blind us.
blind our spiritual discernment.
Yeah.
We are not saved because we are Americans.
Yeah, that's amen. Yeah.
We are saved by the grace of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of Americans who are not believers. There are a lot of Americans who are religious,
Yeah.
but are not believers.
Yeah.
So being American isn't
No.
enough. Just like for Israel, being an Israeli was not
Yeah.
enough. And that is wow. And just to point out one more thing, as we're going to be transitioning out of the storm and we're going to be going into the belly. It's a beautiful picture. In fact, is that the Father served Jonah up to the sailors. Without the storm, all right, they're not going to throw Jonah over. The sailors threw Jonah over. Jonah gave himself over to them.
Mm-hmm.
The picture of Christ, the Father has presented his Son.
Yes.
Yes,
To save the
man crucified and killed the
Yeah.
Messiah.
Yeah.
Jesus laid down his life.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's
It's
just
a three
that's
three
right.
way.
It's
that
a three-way
balance
thing.
of
People say, "Well,
God's sovereignty and man's
did
actions."
Because some people say it's not the murder of Jesus because he laid down his life, but yet it still is.
Yeah.
He was murdered.
Yeah.
But he did lay down his life, and he was given,
By the Father,
by
yeah.
the Father.
It's a beautiful. The more you dig into Jonah, the more analogy you see with Christ.
Yes.
But he obeyed. Jonah, disobeyed initially, but then obeyed begrudgingly.
Right.
But Jesus obeyed initially, and he obeyed lovingly and willingly.
Right.
He came and took on the form of a servant and was made in the likeness of men in order to save his people, his bride. What an awesome thing! So he was the better missionary. So Jonah, we're going to see Jonah was not a willing missionary because he didn't want to go, save a nation that hated him. Jesus not only was a willing missionary to those who hated him, he died for those who hated him.
Yeah.
What a contrast with Jonah. Like, Jonah barely got to Nineveh. I mean, he walks in and says, 8 words?
Yeah.
It's like, blah, 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 blah,
And then leaves.
And then he sits on the hill and waits for lightning bolts
Yes.
to fall, And Jesus didn't just come in and preach one sermon. Jesus gave his whole life. And then, on top of a ministry as a missionary, he lays down his life
Right.
on a hill. Under a tree.
Under a tree.
And Jonah stood on a hill under a tree and complained, and Jesus died on a hill under a tree and freely gave himself to save way more than a city full of people that hate him.
Absolutely.
So what an awesome truth. And Jonah is just proving to be more and more fruitful. So thank you so much for your study through this, by the way. And our church greatly appreciates your sermons and your dedication to the text. And this series has been very challenging for all of us. So our time is almost up. I did want to say before we go to be sure for everyone that attends Emmanuel to stay tuned over the next few weeks for updates concerning these future phases of reopening. Our government and local governments and authorities have rolled out some phases that we're probably going to have to get creative with how we're going to implement all of it. But just stay tuned for that. We're going to be updating everyone regularly on those things. And we are so thankful for your continued support in watching and listening to the show. We love you all. And to you and your family, we say goodbye. God bless. And we'll see you next time.
Love y'all.